Hello, I'm Anika from Made to Sew and welcome to our latest tutorial where I'm going to be sharing with you how to insert a sleeve using a French seam. Now, a French seam is a really useful seam to use on lightweight fabrics such as silk or cotton and sheer fabrics because the seam isn't that unsightly if you can see it through a garment. Now, if you're new to sewing the French seam, I would recommend that you follow the link in the description box below to my standard French seam tutorial and have a go at it on a straight seam first. Now, we're going to be sewing it on the curved armhole seam to introduce the sleeve in this tutorial. Now, this is the inside of the garment, so you can see how the French seam has finished the garment here. It creates a really neat finish. All of the fraying edges of the seam allowance of the garment are encased in the seam itself. It's perfect for lightweight fabrics. This is a crêpe de chine, but cotton and sheer fabrics, as I mentioned, are fantastic with the French seam. If you're working with a really heavy fabric, you would probably find that it would look a bit too heavy and bulky, completing the French seam in it. Now, for this tutorial, I'm going to be working with a seam allowance of 5/8, 1.5 centimeters. And I chose that because it's a standard seam allowance that you'll find in most commercial patterns. If your seam allowance is different to that, you've got two options. You could either increase or decrease your seam allowance to 5/8, 1.5 centimeters, and then you would follow along with the tutorial with the same seam allowances that we're going to be working with. However, you might not want to do that, so if you don't, you can still complete a French seam. You just will need to sew your seam allowance at different increments to what we're using. So I want to give you an example. Our example, let's start with first, is our 5/8, 1.5 centimeters that we're going to be using in this tutorial. When you complete a French seam, you stitch twice. The seam gets sewn twice. The first row of stitching, and then the seam allowance is pressed, trimmed, and then there's another row of stitching. So with a 5/8, 1.5 centimeter seam allowance, the first row of stitching is at 3/8, 1 centimeter from the edge of the fabric. The seam allowance is then pressed and trimmed, and then it's sewn again at 1/4 of an inch, 5 millimeters. I prefer to do it this way around so that we're using up the largest amount of seam allowance first, and then we're left with the smaller 1/4 of an inch, 5 millimeters as our finished seam allowance inside the garment. For another example, we're going to work with 3/8, 1 centimeter total seam allowance. For this, you're going to sew your first row of stitching at 1/8, 3 millimeters from the edge of your fabric. You're then going to press it open. You probably won't need to trim it because the seam allowance will already be nice and small. You will then stitch your second pass of stitching with a seam allowance of 1/4 of an inch, 7 millimeters, to add up to your 3/8, 1 centimeter. I hope that makes sense. So you're going to need to work on a garment that has a sleeve for this tutorial. So collect up your supplies and we can get started. I would like you to start by cutting out 2 of your sleeves in your fabric. You're going to need to mark details such as the notches and the circles onto your fabric. I personally wouldn't recommend that you cut your notches when completing a French seam. You'll find that you will often cut slightly too far for the first row of stitching, and then the cut will actually be visible on the French seam on the inside of the garment. So it's better to be safe than sorry. I recommend that you either use carbon paper to mark all of the details, or you complete tailor's tacks, or use a removable pen of some description. If you're unsure on how to do any of those, I will put some links to corresponding tutorials in the description box below. Once you've marked everything that you need, we're firstly going to start by completing a gathering stitch or an easing stitch. Now, this is something that you need to do to get the sleeve cap to fit into the arm's eye. Generally speaking, the sleeve cap, which is all the way along the top here, will be larger than the arm's eye or the armhole of your garment. To get them to match, you're going to need to complete an easing or gathering stitch along this top of the sleeve cap. I like to think of easing as sort of a mini gathering. So we're going to be using the same stitch length of 4mm that you would use for gathering, but it actually isn't going to look as though the cap is gathered when we are finished. So I sort of refer to it as a mini gathering. It's not a visible gathering. Now, in a commercial pattern, they will often recommend that you complete this stitch between the small circles that you see on the top here, which is why I wanted to show you a commercial pattern. However, I often find that they're a little bit too close together and you end up with sort of visual gathers or puckers along the top of the sleeve cap. So I would like you to actually take your easing stitches a little bit further down the sleeve cap, and we're going to be working from the notches here all the way up and over the top to the other notches. We're going to be completing a stitch length 4 on the sewing machine. We're not going to backstitch, and we're going to be completing 2 rows to provide what's called an even gather in the seam allowance. Now, if you've already sewn up the sleeve seam, please don't worry. You can do that first, or you can complete the gathering stitches first. I personally find it's a little bit easier to complete the gathering stitches first because your sleeve is flat at present. But it really doesn't matter. So if you've already sewn the sleeve seam, do not worry. Go ahead and do the gathers now too. Join me at the sewing machine and I'll show you how we do this. Now I've positioned my sleeve into the sewing machine and I'm going to be stitching along the top of the sleeve cap from one notch to the other notch. I'm going to be stitching in the seam allowance, so my first row is going to be 4/8 or half an inch from the edge, which is 1.2 centimeters. And that's because I'm working with a 5/8, 1.5 centimeters seam allowance. So you want it to be in the seam allowance. I'm going to be using a stitch length of 4mm and I'm not going to backstitch. I want to leave nice long tails at the start and end of my stitching. So I'm just going to guide this through. Moving around the curve as I go until I get to the other notch, and it's going to be producing relatively large stitches at the 4mm length. When I get to my next notch, I'm not going to backstitch. I'm simply going to stop, raise my needle and my presser foot, and I'm going to remove the fabric with nice long tails. As you can see, I've completed my first row of easing or gathering stitching. I've completed this along the top of my sleeve cap from one notch to the other notch. And I haven't backstitched, I've left nice long tails and we'll need those later. You're now going to complete another row of the same stitch length 4 without backstitching, and you're going to do that between this row and the edge of the fabric. Again, from the notch across the top of the sleeve cap to the other notch. Now I'm going to complete another row of stitch length 4 between the previous row and the edge of the fabric. I've made sure that the tails are nicely out of the way, and I'm not going to backstitch. I'm simply going to feed this through the machine, again, aiming for the middle if possible, between the first stitch and the edge of the fabric. Again, you'll just need to work with the curve of the fabric, softly moving it through the sewing machine. I'm doing this between the two notches as we did previously. At the end, you're not going to backstitch, you're going to take this out of the machine and leave long tails as you did before. Now you can see that I've completed 2 rows of the easing or gathering stitching. My first row was about 4/8, half an inch, which is 1.2 centimeters away from the edge of the fabric. So it's in my seam allowance, because my seam allowance is 5/8, 1.5 centimetres. My second row was aiming in between the previous row and the edge of the fabric. I've completed a stitch length 4. I haven't backstitched at either end so that I've got nice long tails for us to pull on. Now, if you haven't done so already, it is time to sew the sleeve seam together. That's joining these two seams to each other. Now, you may wish to use a French seam to complete this as well. And if you haven't completed a standard French seam before, I would recommend that you watch my specific French seam tutorial. I will put a link to that in the description box below. Otherwise, you're welcome to sew a standard seam as you normally would do. Once you've sewn the sleeve seam and you've completed the gathers like we've done here, you can join me back here and we're ready to start introducing our sleeve into our garment. As you can see, I've joined the seam of my sleeve together using a French seam, and I've also finished the hem using a rolled hem. Both of these are perfect for use with silk fabric like I'm using for my top here. You don't have to finish the hem of the sleeve now, but I do find that it can make it a little bit easier than when the garment is all together. If you want to complete a French seam and a rolled hem like so, I will put links to my corresponding tutorials in the description box below. Now it's time to start introducing the sleeve into the garment. The first thing that we're going to do is to gather or ease the sleeve to a smaller size, because as I mentioned earlier, the shape of the sleeve cap is going to be larger than the size of the armhole. So how do we go about doing this? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to pull on the threads that you created with your easing or gathering stitching. You want to take the 2 threads, because we completed 2 rows, and it doesn't matter which side you do this from, if you do this from the wrong side or the right side, it doesn't matter, but you must make sure that you take the 2 threads from the same side. So my 2 threads from my right side are over there, the 2 threads on my wrong side I am holding in my hand. I'm now going to pull on them together, and as I pull on them, I'm going to use my other hand to actually move the fabric down the threads, sliding the fabric down the threads, just like so. And you can see that this gathers up the fabric. And you're going to want to do this so that you sort of pull the gathers all the way over the sleeve cap, and you want to sort of distribute them evenly as well. And this is something that does take a little bit of practice. Now I might do a little bit from one side and a little bit from the other side. So I'm going to go to the other side now. Again, I'm taking 2 threads from the same side, holding those in one hand, pulling on them and using my other hand to move the fabric. Now I like to do a little bit from both sides to make sure that I don't accidentally pull my threads too much on the one side and actually pull them out on the other side. As you can see, I'm pulling on the 2 threads from one side and I'm sliding the fabric on the threads so that it is gathering or easing in the fabric. Now you don't want a mass of gathers, because as I mentioned before, we're not actually gathering the sleeve, we're easing, which is basically a mini gathering, so it shouldn't look gathered or noticeable. I like to use my nails or the sort of tips of my fingers to sort of move the gathering or easing along to try and sort of distribute it evenly. So how much easing or gathering do you need to do to the sleeve cap? Now this is going to depend on the pattern that you're working with and the difference between the size of the sleeve cap and the size of the armhole. I personally don't draft very much ease into my sleeve patterns, so I definitely won't need the amount that I've got here. But I personally like to gather in more than I will need at this stage. I find that it's slightly easier to let it out when I'm introducing the sleeve into the armhole than to try and gather in more. So I try and get it to this shape so that it looks like it's going to fit into an armhole. You've sort of got the circular shape here, and the gathering or easing has pulled the top bit of the sleeve cap over. Something like that will be absolutely great. And then I'll sort of work to try and distribute the gathering or the easing evenly, but you don't need to worry about that too much. We'll work a little bit more on that when we're introducing it into the armhole shortly. Now I wanted to share a little tip that you might find useful to lock the threads. Now you can do this once you've completed and pulled in the required gathering or easing to stop that from coming out. You could also do this on one side to lock the threads while you're pulling the two threads on the other side to make sure that you don't pull them out all the way through the sleeve cap. Now to do this, you're going to place a pin into the seam allowance of your fabric, and you're going to take two of the threads from one side, and you're simply going to do a figure of 8 around the pin. So around the top, around the bottom, around the top, around the bottom, around the top, around the bottom. And you can just do this, you don't need to do it loads of times, just enough time to sort of create a mass of thread around the pin, and that's going to stop the thread here from coming out. Now I'm going to show you how to introduce the sleeve into the armhole. You must make sure that your garment is sewn so that the armhole is ready to introduce the sleeve. And by that I mean that you've sewn the shoulder, the side seam and any other seams that make up your armhole. Now my garment is sitting with the wrong side out here, so all my seam allowances are visible, as is my sleeve. So both my garment and my sleeve are wrong side facing out. The next thing I need to do is to check which sleeve I've got, which armhole is this sleeve going to fit into. If you remember right back at the beginning, I made sure that you notched your sleeve. And you should have one notch for the front and 2 notches for the back of your sleeve. So this sleeve here, my front is this notch here, which would mean, and the front of my garment is facing up, and so that would mean that the front of my garment is facing up, the front of my sleeve is facing up, so this sleeve will fit into this armhole. You really need to make sure that you put the right sleeve in the right armhole, because the shape of the sleeve shouldn't be symmetrical. It will be slightly different on the front curve to the back curve. Now once I've decided which sleeve goes with which armhole, I personally like to put my hand inside the garment to collect the sleeve. And by doing that, what we're aiming for here, because we're doing a French seam, rather than putting the right side of our fabric to the right side of our sleeve, we must put the wrong side of our garment fabric to the wrong side of our sleeve fabric, which is why we've got both the garment and the sleeve wrong side facing out. So my hand is going to go through, and I'm going to join the wrong side of my garment side seam to the wrong side of my sleeve underarm seam. And this on my pattern matches, so my underarm side seam matches my sleeve seam. Not all patterns will match like this. If you've got something different going on, you will need to make sure that you match a notch, which will be your underarm notch, to the side seam, or perhaps a corresponding notch on the garment if it's slightly different pattern. But generally speaking, we're matching the underarm seam with the side seam, wrong sides together, like so. Now once I'm holding onto those tightly, I like to then sort of get inside the garment, so I'm still holding nice and tight with those, but I like to be able to have my armhole open here and my sleeve on the inside of the armhole. So wrong sides together. I've started with the underarm seams that we've got there, and I'm going to position those two nicely together. I'm going to take a pin and I'm going to pin them. I always like to start with the underarm. The underarm is the stable part of the garment. It doesn't have any ease or any gathering, which is why we're working with it first. So I'm going to work my way up the underarm, pinning the edges of the fabric together. And I generally pin as if I were going to sew a sleeve. I like to pin it like this because if you get to the point in a second when we're easing and gathering in our the top of the sleeve cap, if you're to pin like this, you'll find that you can actually often ease a little bit more in, which is perfect when you're pinning it. But when you get to the sewing machine, you may find that actually it won't take the fabric like that and you get a little bit of moving. So I tend to do what's sort of called pin basting. So I'm pinning as if I were going to sew this, and I find that works best for me. But if you prefer another way, it doesn't matter. I'm going this way for my underarm on both sides. So I'm working up for my underarm on the front and my underarm on the back. You will probably have some notches that should match from the sleeve to the garment, and mine do, so that's great. Now I've pinned the underarm nicely here. So next what I'm going to do is to start to work with our easing or gathering that we've done. The first thing I want to do is to find my notch that is at the top of the sleeve. This would probably have been a circle on your pattern. You want to take that and match that with your shoulder seam, or if you don't have a shoulder seam, there will be another circle for it to match with. And we're going to pin that as well. Now what we want to do is to see how the difference of the size of the sleeve cap compares to our arm's eye. As you can see here, my sleeve is actually far too gathered because my sleeve is very tight and my armhole is sort of bagging out on the side there. So what I need to do is actually release some of the gathering. If you've got one of those sort of pin blocker or stoppers in that we did the figure of 8 around, you will need to take that out. And you're just going to gradually release this until it gets to the same size as your armhole. So I like to make it the same size first, which I think I've pretty much got now. There we go. And then I start to try and evenly distribute my gathers or my easing. And I often use my sort of nails and things and the tips of my fingers and sort of move them around so that I'm happy with how that is, and so that I don't have any sort of specific gathers anywhere. Unless you're creating a sleeve that is supposed to look gathered over the top, you don't want any gathers to be visible. Now I'm happy with that. I'm next going to position, I'm going to pick the middle of my armhole, and when I refer to the middle, I mean the bits that we haven't pinned. So we've pinned the top of the shoulder, we've also pinned up to where the gathering or easing started, which was our notch. So I'm going to sort of take a middle point here, and I'm going to take a middle part of the sleeve bit that's free there as well, and I'm going to pop those together. So I sort of work middle to middle, and then you can again work to work the ease out and the gathers out, and I would work middle to middle again. So we're always sort of picking the middle point and working with that, because that's going to distribute the gathers as evenly as possible. And even once you've pinned it, you can keep working with those easing stitches. You can still sort of move the fabric over them to try and prevent any specific gathers. Okay, so that's the one side there completed. That's all nice and it fits together really nicely. I haven't got any prominent gathers on my sleeve cap either, which is great. So now I'm going to do the other side. Okay, this too looks, the sleeve cap is too small for my armhole. Fantastic. So we're going to take out that pin that I popped in to do my figure of 8 and to hold my threads. And you want to always bring your long gathering threads to the inside here, because we will cut those off once this is sewn. You don't want them to be caught in the outside. Then I'm going to release some of the easing and gathering so that we get it the same size as the armhole. Okay, and once we're there, we're going to do the same thing. So we're going to be picking the middle, and again, when I refer to the middle, I mean the bits that aren't pinned. So we've got the shoulder pins, we've got up to our notch, or where our gathering or easing started, pinned. We're going to pick the middle of the armhole, the middle of the sleeve, and put those together and pin that. And as I said, it really is roughly. You don't have to be precise. You don't need to measure the middle or anything. And then between these two pins, we're going to find the middle, put the middles together and pin, and the same between those two pins. And I'm just going to use my fingernails again, make sure I've got out any of those sort of puckers or gathered bits. We don't want any of that showing. Fantastic. And there we go. So at present, the oddest thing about this is, because we're doing a French seam, is that this seam allowance is on the outside. So you can see a dart that I've got in my top there. And this is on the outside at the present, but I promise it won't stay that way, because with a French seam, we're going to be stitching the seam twice. We're going to sew it now like this. We're then going to do a bit of pressing and trimming, and then we will sew it again with the fabric right sides together, which will put it on the inside of the garment. What I would recommend, if perhaps this is the first time for you doing a French seam sleeve, or if you just want to sort of reassure yourself, is that you actually baste or tack this in, okay? I just would recommend it. I think it would mean that you don't have to unpick it, especially if you're working with something delicate like silk. So take a needle and thread and do a basting or tacking stitch around the arm's eye. Now I wanted to share a tip with you for matching your seams, the underarm seam at the sleeve, to the side seam of the garment, so that you have a beautifully consistent seam running up the side of your garment and down through your sleeve. Now, firstly, you're going to match the seams manually. And then we're going to use a clover fork pin to hold them in place. So you can take a little look at the inside here, and obviously I've got the wrong side of my fabric to the wrong side of my fabric. Make sure that the seam allowances are going in their supposed direction, so mine are towards the back. I'm then going to take the clover fork pen and I'm going to position that either side of the seam I'm trying to match. So the legs are going either side of the seam I'm aiming to match. The point of the pin is coming out towards the edge of the fabric, the raw edge of the fabric, and the seam allowance. And the head of the pin itself is sitting up. You must make sure that that's sitting up when you're moving this through the sewing machine. Now I'm going to check that that is matched up correctly by looking at this from the right side of my garment. And by the looks of it, I've got a perfect match. If I didn't, I would move the pin until I was happy with this match. Now what we're going to do is, as we run this through the sewing machine, we're actually going to stitch over the clover fork pin. We're not going to remove it. If this is your first time completing a French seam in the armhole, or perhaps if you're working with a slippy fabric such as silk, I would recommend that you baste or tack the sleeve to the armhole. You want to do this just to the side of your stitching line. So the first row of stitching that we're going to be completing is 3/8 or 1 centimetre. So you just want to do it outside or inside of that to make sure that you don't catch or sew on your basting or tacking stitches. And I would just do this all the way round. A basting or tacking stitch is basically a running stitch, and it doesn't have to look pretty. It can be pretty uneven. It's just a case of holding the layers together. and I would do that all the way around. Now I may still wish to leave my clover pin in here just to make sure that I don't get any movement on those two seams. So if you want to baste or tack, I'm going to let you do that. And then we're going to go to the sewing machine where we're going to sew the first pass on our French seam armhole. At the sewing machine, we're going to stitch our first pass of sewing for the French seam. Now, we have got 5/8 or 1.5 centimetres of a seam allowance to use up in total. I prefer to complete my first pass of stitching for the French seam with a 3/8 or 1 centimetre seam allowance. We will then press, trim and sew again at 1/4 inch or 5 millimetres, and that will add up to our total of 5/8 or 1.5 centimetres. For the ease of sewing around the circle that is the armhole, you should have a piece on your machine that you can actually remove, and you can kind of see that I've pulled that off here so that I can slot my sleeve on and I'm able to sort of move the circle of my armhole around as I'm sewing it. Now I've placed the sleeve against the bed of my machine. The reason why we do this is because the sleeve is slightly larger, as we talked about earlier, than the armhole. So the feed dogs on the bed of the machine will actually help to move the sleeve fabric slightly quicker than the top fabric and hopefully absorb the ease. However, if you would prefer to sew with your sleeve up, you're more than welcome to do so. I position my needle into the fabric and I'm going to start sewing, making sure that the edge of my fabric is on my 3/8 or 1 centimetre marker. Now you always want to start sewing around the underarm. So I've started just before my underarm seam, so I will complete the underarm first, that's the stable part of the sleeve, and then over the top of the sleeve cap. We're going to stitch a couple of stitches forwards and a couple of stitches backwards to secure this, and I'm just doing a normal stitch length of 2.5 millimeters. And as I basted this or tacked this, it should all hold together nicely. However, obviously if you've got pins, you will need to take them out as you go. Now I'm going to be sewing over my clover pin here, and that should make sure that my underarm seam and my sleeve seam are nice and accurate together. And the thing with the sleeve is that you keep needing to rotate the fabric around. You're going to move that around the machine. Depending on the size of your armhole, it can be trickier if you've got a smaller armhole. And the one thing I always mention to my students is that you need to make sure that where the needle is stitching is flat. It doesn't matter if you've got puckers here or if you've got puckers in the seam allowance, but where the needle stitches must be flat, and then it will make sure that you don't have any puckers when you turn it around. And now we're going over the sleeve cap. So again, I'm just making sure I've got my hand and my right hand underneath here. And so I'm just feeling to make sure that I'm not feeding any big puckers into the machine. Whereas my left hand is on top, making sure that everything is flat and smooth here. If you get worried about a pucker starting to form on the top, position the needle in, lift the foot, smooth the fabric out and pop the foot back down. And I'm going to work my way all the way back round to the start, where I'm going to backstitch to fasten the sewing again. Once you've removed the fabric from the machine, you want to check the sleeve side to make sure that you haven't got any puckers or any little bits of fabric that have been caught. Now, if you've got an ever so slight pucker, one thing that I like to do is to use my nails, and I just use my nails or the tips of my fingers to sort of move the fabric along the stitches slightly, and often that will get rid of very, very slight little niggles of fabric that you might have. Now, if you have got a bad pucker, don't think that you necessarily need to unpick everything. What I would recommend is that you start by just unpicking either side of the pucker and then put it through the machine again. And you can sort of do that to treat any of the little problems that you have. Make sure when you put it through the machine again that you backstitch at the start and the end of the stitching so that it's nice and secure. Now I'm going to remove my basting stitches. I've removed my basting and trimmed my threads. As you can see, it currently looks a little odd because the seam allowance is on the outside of the garment. We're now going to take the iron and do a little bit of pressing because we want to press our seam allowances open all the way around the armhole. Now I've inserted a sleeve roll into my sleeve so that I can get a nice press as I'm working my way around the armhole. If you don't have a sleeve roll, then you could use a rolled up towel or something just that would allow you to press these seam allowances open. So I'm simply going to rotate my sleeve around and press the seam allowances open with my iron, heat and steam. Obviously, if you have a delicate fabric, you may need to use a pressing cloth. And I'm going to complete that all the way around. It's a little bit fiddly, but you will get the hang of it. Now time for the scary bit. Once you've pressed the seam allowance open, we're actually going to trim them down. We're going to trim both seam allowances to about 1/8 or 3 millimeters without cutting the rest of your fabric. So you want to have a really small pair of scissors here. You want to get really nice and close and work your way around carefully. Take your time. Now, we really must make sure that you've trimmed this small. It really does need to be 1/8, 3 millimeters, because our next row of stitching is going to be 1/4 inch or 5 millimeters. If what you're cutting now is larger than that, it will be visible when you have finished, and you don't want that to be the case. You don't want to see any of this little bit of seam allowance poking out of your French seam. I wanted to share a few tips for cutting to try and aid you in the process and help you not to cut through your fabric, because we've all been there and done that, and it is a pain. If you were, let's say worst case scenario, to cut through your fabric, hopefully it would just be on the edge here, and I would recommend that perhaps you take a deeper seam now. Maybe depending on how far away you cut, you won't be able to complete a French seam in the end, but remember that we've only at present sewn 3/8, 1 centimeter, and you still have another 1/4 inch, 5 millimeters to go. So I'm right-handed. So I'm holding the scissors in my right hand. You want to invest in a good sharp pair of small scissors. My left hand is actually inside the garment, and I tend to put my fingers right underneath the seam allowance that I'm cutting. I like to actually run the blade of the scissor against my hand so that I can sort of feel that I'm not going to be cutting through. Something to think about here is that when you've got a very sharp pair of pointed scissors, that the point of the scissor can very easily just catch and make a little cut in your fabric. So I try and keep my blade as flat as possible when I'm doing this. And although you won't be able to see because the seam allowance is in the way, my fingers are actually against the blade. My left hand is against the blade of my scissor. I'm checking that I'm not going to be cutting through anything, and I'll work my way along doing that, moving the fabric over my left hand to make sure that it's always flat. I would also generally get very close to this, so I really would be looking at it and making sure that I'm not doing anything. Unfortunately, when I'm filming, I can't do that as easily. And long, smooth cuts to make it nice and neat. Once you've done the two sides, we're then going to have a look at pressing again. Now you can see that I've trimmed both of my seam allowances to 1/8 or 3 millimeters. The next thing that I'm going to do is at the moment, this is the right side facing out here. I now want to put the right sides of my fabric together, just like you would normally sew a seam. So I'm going to grab around this seam that we've sewn, and now I've got the right sides together. So if I were to hold that, it's going to hide the little cut seam allowances that we've done there. Now we're going to press this so that we get a really nice finish. So you want to press this so that the seam is right in the middle of the fold. Again, you will probably find this easiest to do over a seam roll or a rolled up towel. So the seam line is exactly on the edge of my fold here, and I'm going to be pressing this. Again, heat and steam. Okay, and I'm going to be working my way around the arm's eye, doing the same thing. Again, it's a little bit fiddly because you're working with the curve, so just move the fabric as you need it and just press that exact spot that's sitting right. Once you've finished pressing around the armhole, you should find that the previously sewn seam is in the middle of the fold. Now I'm going to be positioning in pins on the body of the garment. My sleeve is in here to make sure that everything stays in place whilst I sew this. If you're working with a slippy fabric or if you're new to this, I would recommend basting it or tacking it like we did previously. Now when we get down to the underarm again, the underarm that will join the side seam of the body of the garment, we want to make sure that we get a match here. Although we currently have a match, we want to make sure it stays that way and we don't get any slip. So I'm going to go to the right side of my garment, and here are the two right sides of the garment. You can see that seam allowance for the first row of the French seam that we stitched. And I'm going to start by matching up the underarm seam to the side seam manually. I tend to grab them between my finger and thumb to make sure that we've got as good a match as possible. And remember that when you're grabbing it, you want to grab it on the stitching line that we're going to be sewing. So that's going to be 1/4 of an inch, 5 millimeters for this seam. Holding that nice and tight, I'm going to get my clover fork pin. The legs are going to go either side of that previous seam. And you want to make sure that the point is going out towards what would be the seam allowance. Now, I always like to double check that I've got a match, and if I haven't, then I will move it. And I haven't, so I'm going to have to move that slightly. I'm now happy that I've got a match on my underarm seam, so I'm going to come back to where I was pinning and finish putting my pins around the rest of my armhole. Then I'll be ready to go to the sewing machine. Once you've done this, join me at the sewing machine and we can finish sewing our French seam armhole. Now I'm going to complete the second row of stitching for my French seam armhole. I've moved the camera slightly further away so that you can see how I move the sleeve around this part of my machine. So I've actually taken the front part of my machine off so that I can slip this section onto or into my sleeve. It allows me to be able to move it around better. Now, I'm going to be sewing 1/4 of an inch, which is 5 millimeters for this second row. I'm going to start and sew the whole of the armhole first. So that's from about here all the way around the armhole and then up and over the sleeve cap. I'm going to be taking the pins out as I go. So let's whip out that first pin. And I've lined this edge up with the 1/4 inch, 5 millimeters on my machine. And I'm going to start with my needle down. Okay, I'm going to back stitch again to begin. A couple of stitches forwards, couple of stitches backwards. And then I'm going to feed this through the machine. Taking the pins out as I go, making sure again that the area I'm sewing is really nice and flat. I'm going to stitch over the clover pin. It's a little bit lumpy here because I've got loads of French seams. I've got a side seam and I've got an underarm seam. So you may find that you need to use the hand wheel to sort of help the machine up and over those seams and to help it over the clover pin as well. Again, I'm sewing this with the sleeve facing my machine. The body of the garment is facing me. And I'm going to simply work my way around. Now I'm going to be using my right hand here to keep checking underneath that I'm not catching anything, I'm not sewing anything. This is all nice and flat. So the right hand checks underneath, the left hand checks on top. Obviously, if you're left-handed, you may want to do that slightly differently. And I'm just moving the curve. So we stitch all the way back to the beginning and then we'll back stitch. And there you have it, your finished French seam. I recommend that you trim your threads. You may wish to press the seam flat before pressing it towards your sleeve. I really hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. You've learned a new technique and you now feel able to master French seams in armholes. Thanks for watching.